Her name was Andrea Hayes. She was 38 years old, sitting at the far end of a polished conference table while someone across from her calmly discussed selling the house she was still living in. He didn't look at her when he said it. "We'll list it by the end of the month." He spoke like it was already done, like the decision had been made weeks ago without her in the room. Like she didn't matter. For 2 years, Andrea had been the one waking up at 3 in the morning to manage pain medication. The one handling hospital calls, insurance forms, and the slow collapse of a man everyone else had already emotionally checked out from. He visited when papers needed signatures. Now he leaned forward, confident, organized, already dividing assets that weren't his yet. At one point, he finally glanced at her, just long enough to deliver it. "You've done your part. But let's be honest, you're not equipped for any of this. You're basically just a housekeeper." No one corrected him. No one even reacted. He moved on to numbers, properties, liquidation timelines, as if she had already been erased. And then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "We'll need you out of the house soon. It's easier to sell it empty." That was the moment everything shifted. Because there was something he didn't know. Something he never asked about. Something their father had done quietly, months before any of them realized what was coming. Across the table, the attorney finally closed the file in front of him and spoke. "I think we should clarify which will we're actually discussing. Before we go any further into this story, tell me what time it is where you are and what city you're watching from. I always wonder how far these stories travel. And if you've ever been underestimated in your own family, hit subscribe and share your story below." The meeting began with a pace that made it clear Andrea wasn't expected to speak. Gregory Sloan sat at the head of the table, his posture composed, his attention fixed on a set of documents he had not yet opened, while Scott Hayes had already taken control of the room without being invited to do so. He leaned forward, one hand resting on a folder he had brought himself, speaking as if the outcome had been agreed upon long before anyone else arrived. Paula Hayes sat beside him, her notebook open, pen moving quickly as she outlined steps that sounded less like discussion and more like execution. She spoke in short, efficient sentences about preparing the property, adjusting the interior, contacting agents who specialized in high-value listings in Denver's commercial corridor. She referred to the house as an asset, never as a home. Andrea remained at the far end of the table, unnoticed in a way that felt deliberate. No one asked for her input. No one paused to acknowledge that she had been the one living in that house, managing everything that had happened inside it. To them, she was already outside the decision. Scott continued without interruption, shifting from the house to the company. He spoke about restructuring, about consolidating holdings, about converting underperforming properties into liquid capital. His tone was confident, controlled, and rehearsed. It was the same tone he used when he needed people to believe that he knew exactly what he was doing. At one point, he gestured toward Andrea without fully turning his head. "She handled the personal side of things," he said, as if summarizing a minor detail. "But the estate, the business, the legal structure, that's where I step in." There was a quiet agreement in the room. Alan Mercer, seated near the side, gave a small nod. No one challenged the statement. It fit the version of the family they all understood. Gregory Sloan finally lifted his eyes from the file in front of him, but he didn't interrupt. He allowed Scott to continue laying out plans, timelines, projections that assumed full control had already been transferred. Andrea watched the way the conversation moved around her, not through her. It wasn't just exclusion, it was assumption. They had already decided who she was and, more importantly, who she was not. Scott moved on to specifics, discussing which properties would be listed first, which tenants could be pushed out to increase valuation, how quickly they could close without drawing attention from partners who might question the timing. His focus stayed on efficiency, on speed, on outcomes that benefited him. Paula added quietly, "If we clear the house early, staging will be easier. Buyers don't like complications." Andrea didn't react. She didn't need to. The pattern was already clear. Gregory Sloane closed the folder in front of him with a soft, deliberate motion that didn't match the pace Scott had set. It was the first movement in the room that suggested the conversation might not be going where everyone expected. Scott noticed it immediately, his words cutting off mid-sentence as he shifted his attention. "That document you're referencing," Gregory said calmly, his voice steady enough to slow the room, "is not the one we'll be using today." The silence that followed didn't come from confusion. It came from something starting to break. Gregory didn't raise his voice, but the room adjusted to it immediately. He reached for a different folder, one that hadn't been part of anything Scott had presented, and placed it flat on the table with a level of precision that made it clear this had been prepared long before today. The seal on the document was intact, untouched, and entirely separate from the paperwork Scott had been relying on. Scott frowned, the first visible crack in his composure. "What is that?" he asked, not waiting for permission to question it. Gregory didn't look at him right away. He opened the folder, flipped to the first page, and adjusted his glasses as if the answer had already been decided. 6 months prior to his passing, Gregory said evenly Richard Hayes executed a new will in this office. It legally revokes all prior versions. The air in the room shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Scott straightened, his posture tightening. "That's not possible." "I would have known." Gregory finally looked up. "You were not present." Paula stopped writing. Her pen hovered above the page, unmoving, her attention locked onto the document as if trying to read it from across the table. Andrea didn't move. She watched. Gregory continued, his tone steady, clinical. The document was signed following a full independent evaluation of mental capacity. There were no concerns. Your father was clear, specific, and deliberate in his decisions. Scott leaned back slightly, but it wasn't relaxation. It was calculation. "Then read it," he said. "Let's hear what changed." Gregory turned the page. The prior structure divided assets between both children, with administrative authority assigned to Scott Hayes. Scott gave a small nod, as if confirming something obvious. Gregory didn't pause long enough for that confidence to settle. "The updated will restructures both ownership and control," he said. "Andrea Hayes is named sole executor of the estate, with full authority over all real estate holdings, corporate shares, and financial decisions." The silence was immediate. Paula's expression shifted first, a flicker of disbelief that she couldn't mask fast enough. Her posture stiffened, her hand slowly lowering the pen onto the table. Scott didn't react right away. His face remained neutral for a moment too long, as if his mind hadn't caught up with what had just been said. Then it did. "No," he said, the word flat, controlled, but hollow underneath. "That doesn't make sense." Gregory didn't respond to the tone. "It is legally binding." Scott leaned forward again, this time without the same confidence he had started with. "He wouldn't do that," he said. "He wouldn't put something like this in her hands." Andrea felt his gaze land on her fully for the first time, not dismissive now, but searching, trying to find an angle that would restore what had just been taken from him. Gregory turned another page. "There are additional provisions regarding occupancy of the primary residence. Andrea Hayes retains full right to reside in the property indefinitely. All associated costs are to be covered by the estate." Paula let out a small breath she didn't mean to make. Scott's jaw tightened. "So you're telling me she controls everything?" "I'm telling you," Gregory replied, "that your father assigned control based on his final assessment of capability and trust." The words settled differently than anything else that had been said in the room. Scott pushed back slightly from the table, his fingers tapping once against the surface, a restrained movement that didn't match the shift happening behind his eyes. Andrea remained still, but something had changed. Not in posture, not in expression, but in position. The space around her felt different, as if the room had quietly reoriented itself without anyone acknowledging it out loud. Scott looked back at the document, then at Gregory, then finally at Andrea again. For the first time, There was no assumption left in his expression, only uncertainty. By the time Andrea got back to the house, the locks had already been changed. She stood on the front step for a moment, not reacting, not knocking right away, just looking at the door as if confirming something she had expected, but hadn't fully believed would happen this fast. The porch light was on even though it wasn't dark yet, a small detail that made the decision feel deliberate. She knocked once. The door opened almost immediately, but only halfway. Scott stood behind it, one hand still on the handle, his body positioned to block the entrance. He didn't look surprised to see her. If anything, he looked prepared. "You should have called," he said. Andrea didn't answer that. Her eyes moved past him, catching a glimpse of the hallway behind him. A few things were already different. Boxes near the wall. A chair missing from its usual place. "I live here," she said. Scott's expression didn't change. Not anymore. The words landed without emphasis, like a decision that had already been processed and finalized somewhere else. Paula's voice came from deeper inside the house. "Is that her?" Scott didn't turn. "Yeah." There was a brief pause, then the sound of footsteps approaching. Paula appeared just behind him, her arms crossed, her gaze moving over Andrea with a quick, assessing look that didn't hide what she thought. "This is exactly what I meant," Paula said. "Complications." Andrea shifted her weight slightly, still calm. "You changed the locks." Scott shrugged once. "It's temporary." "For who?" "For everyone," he replied. "We need control over the property right now. You being here makes that harder." Andrea let the silence stretch just long enough to make the statement sit where it was. "I have legal rights to this house," she said. Scott gave a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "You have paperwork." "That's not the same thing." Paula stepped closer to the doorway, her tone sharper now. "You've been living here without contributing to anything that actually matters. It's time to be realistic." Andrea looked at her, then back at Scott. "You're trying to remove me." "I'm trying to move things forward," Scott said. "And you're in the way." There was no hesitation in it anymore. No attempt to soften the language. Andrea reached into her bag and pulled out a set of keys, holding them up between her fingers before stepping forward just enough to close the distance between them. "These still work on every other door in this house," she said. "And I don't need your permission to use them." Scott's jaw tightened, a visible reaction this time. "You're not understanding the situation," he said. "This isn't about where you sleep. This is about control. You don't have the experience to handle what's coming." Andrea didn't step back. "I handled everything you ignored," she said. "That didn't require your approval either." Paula let out a quiet, dismissive sound. "Taking care of someone doesn't qualify you to run anything." Andrea didn't respond to her. Scott shifted his stance, opening the door slightly wider, but not enough to welcome her in. It was a calculated adjustment, not an invitation. "You can make this harder than it needs to be," he said, lowering his voice, "or you can take what you're entitled to and step aside." Andrea looked past him again, taking in the partial view of the interior that no longer felt neutral. "I'm not stepping aside," she said. The words were simple, but they changed the balance of the conversation in a way that didn't rely on volume or force. Scott held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, as if measuring whether this was resistance he could push through the same way he always had. Then he stepped back just enough to clear the doorway. "Fine," he said. "But don't expect this to stay simple." Andrea walked past him without another word, moving into the house as if nothing about that threshold had changed, even though everything behind it had. Paula turned away first. Scott didn't. The next morning, Andrea sat alone in the office that had never been offered to her before. The room still carried the structure of someone else's control, but the access was different now. Files that had been locked were open. Systems that had required approval no longer did. She powered on the main terminal without hesitation, her movements precise, practiced in a way no one in that house had ever bothered to notice. She didn't start with the obvious accounts. Instead, she moved through archived reports, internal summaries, smaller ledgers that were easy to ignore if you weren't looking for inconsistencies. The numbers weren't wrong on the surface. They were balanced, formatted correctly, aligned with quarterly expectations. That was the point. Andrea slowed down at one entry that didn't match the pattern. It wasn't the amount. It was the structure. A transfer categorized as consulting expense, routed through a secondary entity that didn't appear in the primary ownership documents. She clicked into the details, scanning the metadata attached to the transaction. The authorization signature was valid, but the timing didn't align with any legitimate contract she could find. She opened a second file, then a third. The pattern began to take shape. Small transfers at first, spaced out enough to avoid attention, each one labeled in a way that blended into operational costs. But when viewed together, they pointed somewhere specific. Andrea leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing as she pulled up a consolidated report. That was when the total surfaced. $8 million. Not missing. Not miscalculated. Moved. The distinction mattered. A quiet knock came from the doorway. Andrea didn't turn right away. "Come in." Kevin Brooks stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a level of caution that suggested he already knew this wasn't a routine conversation. He had been with the company long enough to understand where certain questions could lead, and more importantly, who usually asked them. "I heard you were reviewing the internal accounts," he said. Andrea nodded once, still looking at the screen. "You've seen this structure before." Kevin didn't answer immediately. He moved closer to the desk, his attention shifting to the data she had pulled up. "That depends on what you're looking at," he said carefully. Andrea rotated the monitor just enough for him to see the full sequence. Kevin's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. "That entity," he said after a second, "isn't part of the standard reporting chain." "I know," Andrea replied. Kevin glanced at the transaction history again. "Those approvals shouldn't have cleared without secondary review." "They did," Andrea said. Kevin exhaled slowly, the weight of the implication settling in. Andrea reached for another document, opening a file that connected the transfers to a registered holding company. The name was different, the structure layered, but the ownership trace wasn't difficult to follow if you knew where to look. She turned the screen back toward herself and pulled up the final detail. Kevin didn't need to ask. "Is it him?" he said. Andrea didn't respond right away. She let the information sit where it was, complete, undeniable, without adding anything that wasn't already there. Then she nodded. Kevin looked down at the desk for a moment, processing. "That's not a mistake," he said quietly. "No," Andrea replied. "It isn't." The room fell into a controlled silence, not from uncertainty, but from clarity. Andrea closed the file, her hand steady. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about what had been done before anyone thought to question it. The boardroom fell quiet the moment Andrea stepped inside. Every seat at the table was already taken, and Scott was standing near the center, mid-explanation, one hand resting on a set of printed projections laid out in front of him. His voice cut off as he noticed her, the interruption sharper than any raised tone could have been. No one spoke. Andrea didn't rush. She walked to the far end of the table, placed her folder down, and remained standing, not asking for space, not waiting for permission. Scott recovered first. "This is a closed session," he said, his voice measured again, trying to regain control of the room. "We're in the middle of a decision that affects all stakeholders." Andrea looked at him, then at the others seated around the table, including Alan, who avoided her eyes for a brief second before settling back into a neutral expression. "This decision includes me," she said. Scott exhaled slowly, as if dealing with something inconvenient rather than unexpected. "Not at this level." Andrea opened the folder. The sound was small, but it shifted the attention in the room more effectively than anything Scott had said. Kevin was seated along the side, his posture still, his hands folded in front of him. He didn't look surprised to see her, but he didn't intervene either. Andrea slid a document across the table, stopping it just short of Scott's reach. "You're presenting a restructuring plan," she said, "based on incomplete financial reporting." Scott didn't touch the paper. "We've already reviewed the numbers." "No," Andrea replied. "You've reviewed what was left visible." A few of the board members exchanged glances, subtle but enough. Scott's expression hardened. "If you have something to add, you can do it through proper channels." Andrea reached into the folder again and placed a second document on the table, this one positioned so the others could see it more clearly. "This is a transfer record," she said. "One of several." Alan leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening. Scott's jaw tightened, but he still didn't move. Kevin finally spoke, his voice controlled. "I verified those entries this morning." That shifted it. The room reacted, not loudly, but collectively, the kind of shift that happens when uncertainty becomes something closer to fact. Scott turned toward Kevin, the composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "You're overstepping." Kevin didn't respond. Andrea continued without raising her voice. "The funds were routed through an external entity that isn't disclosed in any official ownership structure. The transactions were categorized to avoid review thresholds." She paused just long enough for the information to settle. "The total amount moved is $8 million. No one interrupted her. Scott let out a short breath, something between disbelief and irritation. "You're making assumptions based on partial data." Andrea slid the final page forward. "This isn't partial." Alan reached for the document this time, pulling it closer, scanning quickly, then more carefully. His expression shifted in a way he didn't attempt to hide. "This links directly back to internal authorization," Alan said. Andrea nodded once. "Yes." Scott's voice dropped, lower now, less controlled. "You don't understand how these structures work." Andrea looked at him steadily. "I understand exactly how they work." Silence held the room in place. Scott's hand moved toward the table, then stopped, as if he had realized too late that any reaction would confirm more than he could afford to admit. Andrea didn't step forward. She didn't need to. "This isn't a discussion about strategy," she said. "It's a question of accountability." Kevin leaned back slightly, his role complete, no longer needing to add anything. Alan closed the file in front of him, slower this time. Scott looked around the room, searching for alignment, for support, for anything that would restore the structure he had walked in with. He didn't find it. The projections in front of him were still there, but they no longer mattered. For months later, the house remained exactly where Andrea had left it. Nothing had been staged, nothing had been cleared out, and nothing had been prepared for sale. The decisions that had once been spoken about as inevitable had simply stopped existing. The process never moved forward, not because it couldn't, but because the authority behind it had changed in a way no one could override. The investigation moved quietly at first. It didn't come with announcements or visible action. It came through requests, document pulls, and formal inquiries that carried more weight than any argument ever had. Financial records were reviewed, authorizations traced, structures examined in detail that no longer allowed anything to stay hidden behind assumptions. Scott was removed from operational control before the process was finished. There was no formal confrontation when it happened. No final meeting where he explained himself or defended what had been uncovered. The decision was procedural, documented, and immediate. Access was restricted, responsibilities reassigned, and the position he had built his identity around was no longer his to hold. Paula left not long after. There were no discussions about staying, no attempts to adjust or negotiate. She packed what belonged to her and walked away from the situation with the same clarity she had once used to define it. Whatever she had expected the outcome to be, it wasn't this. Andrea didn't follow any of it closely. She didn't attend the reviews, didn't involve herself in the details of what came next for Scott, and didn't ask for updates beyond what was necessary to maintain the structure she now controlled. The outcome wasn't something she needed to witness step by step. The house became quiet in a way it hadn't been before. Not empty, not unfinished, just stable. The kind of stability that comes from decisions no longer being questioned every time they're made. Andrea moved through it without urgency, handling what needed to be handled, leaving what didn't untouched. One afternoon, her phone rang. She looked at the screen long enough to recognize the name, then set it back down without answering. It rang again and then stopped. No message followed. Andrea didn't check. There wasn't anything left to clarify, and there wasn't anything left to recover. Whatever had existed before had already been defined by choices that didn't require explanation now. She stood by the window for a moment, looking out at a street that hadn't changed, even though everything connected to it had. For a long time, she had been treated as if her role was temporary, conditional, something that existed only when it was useful to someone else. That version of her had been accepted by everyone around her, including the people who should have known better. But control isn't given based on who speaks the most or who appears the most prepared. It settles where it can't be taken without consequence. Andrea didn't feel the need to prove anything anymore. She had already done that in the only way that mattered.